Yeah, okay. Sarah, thank you very much for your contribution and also to all the other presenters. And now we can come to the question and answer session. And I would give us some minutes until, let's say, 3 o'clock, so that we still can have a short coffee break to go into bilateral discussions before we close up this event. So is there any ad hoc question from the audience yet? Okay, I have 2 microphones, so I try.
Okay, thank you. That's for the last 2 speakers. So my name is Stephanie Köpsel, German Energy Consultant Network. So we have more than 1,000 members who are actually going into the houses, assessing it and doing a lot of EPCs. And I'm listening here and seeing a lot of scientific approaches how to do the EPCs. And I'm asking myself how we should do that to convince people to do renovations. So my question would be, what kind of approach would you maybe have to ease things to make it easier for us to do the assessment? Like in the end, we want to convince people to do renovations. That's our aim. And I think we have to pay attention that we're not discussing every detail. For instance, like the indoor climate, honestly, multi-family houses in Germany, the people who are hiring the flats do not really care about the indoor climate for their inhabitants. They're more interested, like how much is a new heating system? So how can we do that really easier to have an approach that works in practical life? That would be my question to the last 2 speakers, and maybe also the quality issue, how we do the qualification of the assessors, of the energy experts. How can we maybe approach that? Because we're also working on having a profession in Germany that's not existing at the moment. Okay.
Thank you. And David?
Yeah, so I mean, I would have a strong distinction between residential and EPC assessors and non-residential EPC assessors. I mean, my own view is that residential EPC assessments have to be relatively simple, and we should judge them not by accuracy. I almost don't care about accuracy of residential EPCs. It's, are they actually causing anything to happen? Are they stimulating positive action? So it's, I'm sort of, even though I'm a building physicist, building modeler, I'm sort of relaxed about a residential energy assessor having relatively low qualification requirements, doing relatively simple assessments, doing them competently, but relatively simple. And I'm not entirely convinced that we need to be increasing the amount of monitoring and the time of the assessment. I'd have a slightly different view for non-residential buildings, where we already have really quite competent people that understand buildings and understand building physics. An EPC assessor doing that non-residential energy assessment is more likely to have the background, even in the UK, more likely to have that background of building physics and understanding energy assessment. And in that case, why not use more tools? Why not use the science we have? I mean, if a data scientist, for example, stepped into the EPC land and looked at the kind of assessments we did, it would probably feel like they're stepping back in time, because we're not making the most of the state of the art, and we're not making the most of data science, of AI, or all these things that we could use to do more effective energy assessments. But there's no point doing all that if our audience don't care about the outputs that we're producing. So that's why I would have that distinction between residential, non-residential. I'm not sure how much things like thermal scores and SRIs really matter to a lot of energy, a lot of residential customers who just want their energy bills to be lower. Whereas non-residential, I think it's different. It's a different audience, different type of EPC assessor, and we should have a strong dividing line between those two sectors.
Yeah, so I think you're totally right that it's very important for EPC to focus on how we trigger those different renovation. I think in link with what I've presented, the idea is really not to make it more complicated for the assessor. It's on the contrary, for them doing the same amount of work or even using less time, to be able for them to propose something that is more reliable and then trusted by not necessarily the building user, but the policymaker, the financial, the people that make the financial decision, so that we're confident that if the renovation happen, that the savings both in cost and in emissions are going to be what we expect. But our goal in the project is really not to complicate the work of the assessor.
Eric Cornelis, Annick, I do not fully agree with your comment and residential building. It depends on the context. In Flanders, Belgium, there is an obligation to renovate until level D, and that's the start. So future legislation will push for more stringent renovations to level C, B, until A. And if there is a obligation to renovate until a certain level, then you want to be sure that that level assessed by the practitioner is correct.
Yeah, but but does it need to be accurate in terms of the kilowatt hour number? If you're giving good advice to the owner of that building and you're getting them to do good things, that's the threshold of success for a residential and EPC. I mean, if your goal for accuracy is that you produce residential EPCs that can get close to real energy consumption, then that's a pointless. That's chasing the end of a rainbow. There's no point going down that route. Well, I would say that there are, not to contradict myself slightly, but some of the modeling options that were spoken about in EPC RECAST, like use of dynamic simulation in residential EPCs, that's definitely a road we should be exploring. Because I mean, in the UK at the moment, where it looks like we're going to change the residential energy assessment to include dynamic simulation as the calculation engine behind EPC. And why not do that? If you can still keep a simple assessment that can be carried out for millions of buildings, why not include better building physics in the engine of the assessment? But I still think you need to limit. You have to accept. I mean, in the case of the UK, I hope there's no residential EPC assessors online listening to this. But in the case of the UK, the minimum threshold for building physics knowledge isn't somebody that understands how a dynamic simulation model works. That might not matter if you package it up in an interface where they don't need to understand how it works, but you have to be really careful, I think, in terms of what you're asking a residential EPC assessor to do at scale. Otherwise, you'll create a perfect way of doing it and you'll run it for 10 buildings. Yeah, we don't want to do that. We want to do it for millions of buildings and give good advice off the back of it.
Yeah, Peter.
Yes, thank you. Peter from EFOI again. My question goes more or less also to Sarah and David. I think quality of EPCs always is, of course, desirable and interesting, but when it really gets interesting is, I think, when you put obligations to that. So when EPC classes cause obligations, which should become the case in case of non-residential buildings from the maps. And then the question is, we had that one case, which you mentioned, Sarah, where you put a number of experts on the same building, and you have that range, which is an indicator for no high quality. So in this case, thankfully, they were mostly in D. And the other question is, how good should I mirror that real building and the real consumption, which is, of course, not only related to the quality of the building, but also to the behavior of the inhabitants. So, and I think it's like, yeah, you're a bit trapped in that because you cannot have the correct measurement. Or so do you deal with these questions as well? So when is it legally binding, or when is it legally hard enough to put the obligations to that?
Hi, sorry, so you had two parts of your question, and I've already forgotten the first part. Yeah, you were you were commenting about the case in Italy. So that's a paper. It's from 2012. It was the beginning of EPC. So I have the hope. I took this one because it was the one with the best illustration. But I have the hope that things have improved a bit since then, as people gain experience. But it would be an interesting experiment to actually repeat. And I think in link with all the comments that we have had before, if we're putting those mandatory thresholds, then it becomes very important to have accurate, because, for example, I know in France they've started already to not let people sell or rent below a certain letter. And so then you want to make sure that if you're going to force someone to do renovation, it's because the house actually needs renovation, because in the end, it's also a big constraint on the owners of the buildings. So that's a bit why I think it's very important that we make sure that those EPC are reasonably accurate. I agree that they don't maybe need to be at the comma, but that we're confident that if something is a class D and we're gonna ask them to pass to the following class, it's that they really are. And then maybe a final comment, this is a bit outside of the scope of EPC RECAST, but I think there is, at the moment, there is a lot of, there is countries where you can do either asset rating or operation rating. And I think if we want people to really understand what an EPC is, a building owner, I think it would be actually very interesting to do both, to say, okay, this is the asset rating of the building. This is what the legislation is based with. And based on your consumption, this is the class that you are. And that I think would really help to communicate better what an EPC is.
Just so quickly to add to that, so on your first point, yeah, I do get slightly worried when EPCs, or as EPCs have moved from advisory to mandatory. It makes me feel a little bit worried, because you know what's behind the EPCs, and it's one thing saying this would be a nice thing to do, to saying you have to do this. I tend to be more comfortable with relating mandatory action to specific things that you have to do, like change your heating system to something that's a zero carbon heating system. That's black and white. We're not relying on a slightly simple model to make that judgment. And that's why one of the criteria in that table I showed had suitability for punitive action as a, you know, can we make a judgment on that as to whether it's okay to make somebody do something on the back of this EPC method. So that's one point. And then on your second point, kind of related, EPCs don't do people, so we should stop maybe worrying so much about the performance gap, because of course there's going to be a performance gap, because our EPC methods don't understand people. They're not designed to understand human behavior in buildings in any level of detail at all, and nor should they really for what they're trying to do. So performance gap is interesting. And there are, you know, we've already got examples of EPCs actually doing something wrong, but it's, for me, that's not about a percentage difference with real energy consumption. That's just them not modeling a system properly, or coming up with the wrong conclusion from the inputs that you've given them. That needs to be fixed. But the performance gap thing, that's always going to exist, because EPCs just don't do human beings.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I also can add one thought, which I often observe. EPCs are not to design the building. You know? They are there for giving a hint on how good buildings are, yes, and not for designing. Otherwise, we would do the most conservative design for a building as a construction engineer, yes. But I have a question maybe for Peter, because this came up in the last presentations as well, that we need common data models, and you also had these different modules, like I understood as apps for your assessment. And would you agree on that statement, that that would be a need for further developing the EPCs?
It really depends. So I agree with you, David. Maybe it's easier to have the obligations just on the list, and you can say black or white. Yes, my outer wall is insulated in a way or not, and then I can put obligations on that, and it's clear. Whereas the further development of an EPC may lead us to some more complicated things we don't really need. But okay, from IBRO to EPC perspective, I would say we should transport this vision of not only looking at today, but looking to the target, so 2050, and having that spread as much as we spread the EPC. That would be my wish. So it's a further development, but maybe to another direction.
Yeah, thank you. There's another question.
Thank you. João Cleto from the Portuguese Energy Agency, and this is a question for the EU SuperHub and the standardization. You mentioned the KPI set that you have set up. Looking at it very briefly, it seems they are very well in tune with the EPC template indicators. But I wanted to just to make sure that if you have made that comparison or not. And related to this, you also, if I understood it correctly, you defined qualification levels for the professionals in each KPI, let's say. And my question is, typically we have one assessor for an EPC. And do you think that in the future, when we add layers and layers and layers, we would need more than one professional? Would a typical energy assessor, which I know it's not the same in all countries, be able to fill in all those KPIs?
So many thanks for your question. I'll start with the latest part. Let's say, since I mentioned before that we have a list of competencies for the assessors of the building, but let's say the CWA Train for Sustain is organized in a way that it concerns single competencies. So maybe you have many references, but they should go into the same figure, actually. Maybe you can have a separation between architects, I don't know, and other kinds of professional which might intervene in all the process. But in the link with the EUB SuperHub, let's say we focused on the assessors and their competencies. So I don't know personally, but I don't think the expectation is to have a large number of assessors intervening at the same time, but most of all, more competencies on one figure, which this should be the aim and the scope of also of these two CWAs. For the first part of the question on the KPIs, maybe you will have to repeat again because I'm not sure I'm answering well, but let's say that for KPIs, we try to set on quantitative but rather than qualitative aspects. So we avoid only qualitative information because it's more it's not it's because qualitative KPIs might not be that objective as measurable and calculable ones can be. So that's the approach we used for that. I don't know that I don't know if I well answered to your first part of the question. In case I can exploit more.
Maybe short clarification, then we need to close this.
No, it's just checking just if every KPI is there is a list on the new EPBD with the EPC template. There are indicators, just checking if they all fit or if there's something missing or not. That was just
no. If I remember correctly, every KPI answers to these let's say characteristics. So they should be as you like it.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I would like then to close this session and thank you for giving us these insights. And as we see, we have lots of approaches for next generation EPCs. And now it comes also to implementation, and implementation is not just a snip away, it's still work. And I think we have seen that we need to harmonize. And I liked your question, what do we harmonize? Because in what do we want to compare? And how can we build upon what we have already? Yeah, that's, I think, the big point we have for implementation in the different countries. And so I wish you a fruitful discussion in the short coffee break. And you, Alexander, will announce how we will proceed after coffee break.
So 15 minutes coffee break, but please be back here at 15 minutes.